Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, the climate guy setting the record straight about climate. The summer of 1936 was by far the hottest summer in U.S. history, and July 6, 1936 was a particularly hot day. North Dakota reached their all-time record high temperature of 121 degrees at Steele. Now let's go back in time a couple weeks and put this in perspective. 2 weeks ago, climate scientists were spreading all sorts of misinformation about Arizona having a record-setting heat wave. Global heat waves are the new norm. Arizona's heat's getting worse and it's killing people. Record heat wave. Are any of these claims true? Rather than trusting climate scientists and the press, it's always a good idea to look at the data for yourself, because they're almost always wrong. The hottest temperature that Phoenix achieved last month on June 20th was actually only 119 degrees, well below what they forecast and well below their record high of 122 degrees, which was set almost 30 years ago. The year I started attending Arizona State University, 1974, was the peak year of the Ice Age scare, and they had 18 consecutive days over 110 degrees Fahrenheit. That June 1974 heat wave remains the longest heat wave on record in Phoenix. Phoenix doesn't have very good long-term temperature records, but Parker, Arizona along the Colorado River does. This graph shows the hottest daily maximum temperature at Parker, Arizona every year since 1895. During this year's heat wave, Parker got up to 123 degrees. But in 1905, they got up to 127 degrees. And you can see that prior to 1905, temperatures got very hot in Parker, and generally they haven't been getting that hot since then. And it's not just the intensity of heat waves that used to be higher in Parker, but the duration used to be higher too. This graph shows the number of days above 115 degrees Fahrenheit at Parker, Arizona every year since 1895. The longest duration heat wave at Parker occurred in 1896 when they had 23 days over 115 degrees. Summers in Parker used to be much hotter. The peak number of days above 115 degrees occurred around the beginning of the 20th century and then declined sharply after that. Like essentially everything else you hear about climate, claims of record heat in Arizona in June 2017 were just fake news. Now let's compare this to the July 6, 1936 heat wave. On July 6, 1936, Steele, North Dakota hit 121 degrees, 2 degrees warmer than Phoenix's hottest temperature this year. And Phoenix is way down south. North Dakota is way up north by Canada. This map shows in red all the stations in the United States which were above 100 degrees on July 6, 1936, and the yellow pins show all the stations that were above 90 degrees on that day. Almost the entire U.S. was over 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and a huge area of the U.S. was over 100 degrees. Let's zoom in on some of the really hot temperatures up here in the Great Plains and in the upper Midwest. Temperatures over 110 degrees all over Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Minnesota, and 100-degree temperatures over into Indiana. It was hotter on July 6, 1936 in North Dakota than Phoenix got to in 2017. Imagine if this happened now. Junk climate scientists like Michael Mann would be all over television. They'd be making claims like, "We're 99% certain this is due to the greenhouse effect. It's your fault for driving your SUV." But July 6, 1936 wasn't actually the peak of the heat wave. Temperatures were only going to get hotter as the summer went on. Here's the Chicago Tribune from July 7, 1936. Crops scorch in 100-degree heat. Torrid blasts for Chicago. Grain prices soar as havoc mounds. And look at these temperatures. 119, 119, 118, 118. These aren't temperatures in Arizona. These are temperatures in North Dakota up near the Canadian border. And the heat wasn't just in the United States, it was in Canada too. The Ottawa Journal was reporting temperatures over 110 degrees in Saskatchewan. 1936 wasn't an isolated incident. Summers used to be much hotter in the United States. This graph shows the average percent of days over 100 degrees Fahrenheit at all United States historical climatology network stations. This is NOAA's official U.S. temperature record. The frequency of hot days in the United States has plummeted over the last century. Prior to 1960, 100-degree days were much more common than they are now. Here's 1936. Almost 5% of days in the United States were over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Compare this to 2016, which NOAA says was the hottest year on record. Only about 1% of days were over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. 100-degree days were 5 times more common in 1936 than they were in 2016, which was supposedly the hottest year ever. Climate scientists can get away with this fraud because there's very few people old enough to remember the heat of the 1930s. But the 1930s were much hotter, and in fact the 1950s were much hotter too. Almost everything you hear about climate is fake news, but it's possible that the fakest news being propagated is about heat waves. Heat waves used to be much worse in the United States, and it's time for climate scientists and the press to stop lying about this. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a long time.